Hi, this is History with me, Dan. My last video was about the early history of Dutch Point in Hartford, Connecticut. If you haven't watched it, I'll put a link to it in the description below. Dutch Point, shown here in a section of the bird's eye view of Hartford of 1877, was a narrow peninsula formed where the Park River met the Connecticut River. The peninsula was home to a shipyard and a lumber mill. In this video, I'm going to talk about that lumber mill's role in the late 1870s and early 1880s in the massive log drives down the Connecticut River that each year brought millions of feet of lumber from the Connecticut lakes just south of the Canadian border in northern New Hampshire all the way down to Hartford. In 1876, the Hartford Lumber Company was established at Dutch Point. The president of this new concern was John Ross, a legendary lumberman from Bangor, Maine, who for years had been in charge of the log drives on the west branch of the Penobscot River in eastern Maine. A new era of massive log drives down the Connecticut had begun in 1869. And it continued for the next 46 years. These annual drives began each spring at the headwaters of the Connecticut in northern New Hampshire, just south of the Canadian border. Here, over the winter, rugged lumberjacks felled trees and piled up millions of feet of logs, awaiting the melting of the ice. Then the lumbermen became rivermen, guiding the logs as they floated on an epic journey over 300 miles down the river, through challenging obstacles that included dangerous waterfalls and treacherous narrows, as well as man-made obstructions such as bridges and dams, to reach sawmills at Northampton and Holyoke, Massachusetts. In 1876, John Ross would drive the logs even further south, to the sawmill at Dutch Point in Hartford. Ross and his partners had acquired about 100,000 acres in the town of Pittsburgh at the northern tip of New Hampshire. As the Hartford Courant newspaper described it on September 6, 1876, quote, "For 25 years no logs have been floated down the river as far as Hartford, and never at a period of such low water has anyone attempted to bring them down at all. But Ross, who is an experienced Maine lumberman, with a force of 100 men from the shores of the Penobscot, including 15 Indians, started on the 29th of May with about 18 million feet of spruce and pine logs, 6 million feet of which were destined for Hartford, 2 million for Holyoke, 4 million for Northampton, and the rest for various places above. On Thursday, the first few logs, they had been formed into rafts at the lower end of the Windsor Locks Canal, reached Hartford, and with them came a curious canoe-like boat, such as they use in log driving. With them, too, came Mr. Ross, the king of log drivers, bound to see the enterprise through to the end. The feat which he has accomplished is really a wonderful one, and excited great admiration among those persons up the river who were capable of appreciating its difficulties. He takes the lead with a few picked men, picks out the courses, and arranges the dams in such a way as to permit the passage of the logs. The men camp out on the riverbank at night." Unquote. Ross and his men had indeed accomplished quite a feat. In fact, Hartford gamblers had laid odds of 5 to 1 that they would fail. It was incredibly dangerous work for the strong and agile North Country rivermen, who have been described as the cowboys of the East. They wore boots with inch-long spikes to keep their footing on floating logs, and they wielded a tool called a peavey or a cant dog a long wooden pole with a metal spike and a pointed hook at the end. Log jams were a frequent hazard. While working to push the logs apart, sometimes a riverman would slip, get caught between the logs, and drown. Despite the danger, which led to several deaths a year, these fearless men would come back to the log drive season after season. As the Hartford Current described it on June 11, 1880, quote, "The Connecticut logger's main duty consists in preventing the logs from getting jammed, or starting them when they get stuck on sandbars, bridges, or other obstacles. For this purpose, teams of horses accompany each large collection of logs, or drive, as it is technically called. Notice must often be given in advance of the coming of the drive for the sudden appearance of 20 or 30 million feet of logs, which is the number being floated down this season, may become quite a serious matter, especially if the jam extends 5 miles and cannot be broken up for several days, as happened last year at 15 Mile Falls, New Hampshire." Unquote. As time went by, the loggers used dynamite to more efficiently break up big log jams. In about 1879, the Hartford Lumber Company was succeeded by the Connecticut River Lumber Company, whose partners continued to drive logs down the Connecticut. As described in picturesque Hampshire in 1890, quote, "The distance from the woods to Hartford and the dams at Holyoke and Windsor locks, besides the trouble made by logs with so many inhabitants in Holyoke, Springfield, and Hartford, as the logs floated without protection for many weeks past these places, soon convinced these men that Holyoke was the lowest place on the river to which logs could be profitably driven. In 1879, this company bought the Mount Tom Mill and all the business interests connected with it from the McKindo's Lumber Company. They also leased the Holyoke Mill from the Holyoke Lumber Company." Unquote. The mills at Mount Tom and Holyoke each had double the capacity of the mill at Dutch Point. For several more years, however, logs would still be brought as needed from the great boom at Mount Tom down the river to another boom just above the railroad bridge in Hartford. In some years, this lumber was shipped even further than Hartford for milling. On September 19, 1878, the Current reported that the last of 3 monster timber rafts, each consisting of 2 million feet of lumber, was being formed just below the Hartford Bridge. These rafts were then pulled by tugboats down the river to Long Island Sound and then to a sawmill in New Haven. This postcard shows a similar log raft on the Mississippi River. The article continues, quote, "The shipment of this raft nearly exhausts the supply of logs that have rested in the great boom above the railroad bridge since their arrival from the headwaters of the river early in the summer. But the company has a large part of last winter's cutting yet in the boom near Holyoke. It is expected that a large part of these will be brought downstream this fall and stored at the great log pile on the bank of Little River just above Dutch Point. At this place, for a distance of over 200 yards, logs are pulled up to a height of from 20 to 40 feet. These are drawn from the river and piled up at an expense of less than a cent for each log. The outer ends project some distance into the river, barely leaving a channelway, but it is claimed that a freshet would not disturb them, as the higher ones are out of reach of the highest rise, and the lower strata are securely held by those above." Unquote. On June 7, 1879, the Current described another year's activity. Quote, "The main drive of 33 million feet is coming downstream under the management of nearly 300 men. On Monday last, the rear was just passing North Stratford, New Hampshire, about 100 miles from the starting point. The low water has occasioned considerable delay and trouble, and especially at 15 Mile Falls above McKindo's. For a distance of 15 miles, the river runs over a bed of broken rocks, and a good freshet is needed to prevent the lodgment of the logs. This main drive will be checked at McKindo's, the logs sorted, and it will then move downstream to the Mount Tom Mills. The greater part will be held there, and only 13 million feet will be sent to Hartford, reaching here probably in August. For 2 weeks past, the supply of logs at the Hartford mill has been exhausted, and until the arrival of fresh material, the works will be comparatively idle, and the machinery repaired and put in complete order for the fall and winter campaign." Unquote. Another current article, this one from July 24th, 1882, also describes the log's journey to the Hartford boom, and continues, quote, "From this boom, the mill here is now being supplied. It has used up in a single day 319 logs, and made them into beams, joists, boards, lath, and kindling wood. No part of a log appears to go to waste. Even the sawdust finds its place in supplying fuel to the furnace. The mill has, during the winter and spring, used up the thousands of logs that were drawn in last year into Park River, or, as it is termed around Dutch Point, where its odors are known, Park Sewer. Again this summer, the banks of the river will be piled up with logs, shingled, the lumbermen call it, because as drawn up, one overlapping the other, the mass looks not unlike a shingled roof. The logs will be towed down from the boom above the bridge by a tug, the company's busy, puffing little owl, whose black, shapely hull is a familiar sight on the river. The company will send no rafts of logs this year at least to New Haven. 3.5 million feet were rafted there last summer, consigned to the New Haven Steam Sawmill Company. The Hartford Company thinks it can make quite as much money cutting up the logs at its own mills as by selling them." Unquote. By about 1885, it seems that the log drives had ceased coming as far south as Hartford. In 1889, the Current described the company's sawmill at Dutch Point as disused, and there were strenuous objections in the neighborhood when the company arranged to provide space on its property to a bone-boiling works, which were guaranteed to emit foul odors over a wide area of nearby Coltsville. In 1897, the former sawmill was being rented to the neighboring shipyard of the Hartford and New York Transportation Company when the old building burned down in a fire. While Hartford was no longer participating in the log drives, they continued from New Hampshire to Holyoke each year under the direction of George Van Dyke, the millionaire lumber baron who was known as the Lumber King of New England. Later, in 1897, there was an accidental return to the old days, when a June flood loosened over 20 million feet of logs at the Holyoke boom and sent them down the river. An emergency boom had to be constructed near the railroad bridge in Hartford to gather the errant logs, and the city issued a permit allowing the Connecticut River Lumber Company to erect a temporary mill at Dutch Point to saw the reclaimed lumber. On August 8, 1909, George Van Dyke, King of New England lumbermen, was at Turner's Falls, Massachusetts, observing by automobile the progress of his latest log drive, containing 53 million feet of lumber. He'd instructed his driver to stop the car at the edge of an embankment above the river. But when they were about to leave, both men were killed when the vehicle accidentally went over the edge, falling 75 feet. The great log drives finally came to an end 6 years later, in 1915. This was due to several factors, such as the depletion of the northern forests and the expenses the company was incurring from lawsuits that kept cropping up over the drive's disruption of all other traffic on the river, and the damage that the logs caused to bridges, dams, and farmers' meadows. According to one member of the company, interviewed by the Hartford Courant on July 24, 1882, quote, "There is expense everywhere, and it is a curious fact that few would think of, that we have to pay thousands of dollars every year for land damages. Why, we practically pay the taxes of the farmers all along down the river to Mount Tom or below. The high water sends some logs over upon a man's land, and he comes up with a claim for damage to his mowing for more than the land is worth. And a country jury seldom has much mercy for a corporation. We paid out thousands of dollars for this item alone last year." Unquote. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video about Dutch Point and Hartford's involvement in the big log drives. In a future video, I want to cover how Dutch Point was completely changed with the building of a power plant since demolished, and the diverting of the Park River through an underground conduit. So please hit the like button, and remember to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching.